Welcome back to the This Sounds Better podcast with Miles Walker, Jason Kingsland, and myself, Alex Tumay. Today we are talking about one thing and one thing only, vocals and tuning and comping. So 3 things.
It's like one with a bunch of subheaders.
Yeah, it's like one thing and one thing only, these 3 things.
Exactly. You know? The trifecta of single things.
So I get asked about this all the time, and people want to know, what do I use to tune vocals? Autotune, Wavetune, Melodyne, etc. I mean, those are the 3 major ones, I would say. And for me, you know, in the rap world, there's really only one answer. Autotune. Antares Autotune, Autotune Pro, Autotune 5, Autotune 8.1. You know what I mean?
In the pop world, I'd say there's more than one answer. A lot of people have specific ones that they like, and I definitely like Autotune too for that quick solution. But if we're going for a more natural vocal, I might go to different algorithms. I think Melodyne sounds really good for trying to pull off a believable performance, but it's definitely a different feel. So, you know, just calls on for the whatever the record calls for, really.
Yeah, and I think that with anything, it's just always picking the right tool and finding the thing that's right for the job. Like, it would make no sense for you to put Thug into Melodyne. It's simply not going to do the thing you want to do and take you a million years to do it that way.
I've tried it.
Have you?
Yeah, it's just not as cool.
Really?
It's just not as cool. It sounds great. It sounded amazing. You know what I mean? It sounded natural, smooth, all that. It just didn't have any of that feeling because he sings into Autotune.
Exactly.
And I think,
so it's a performance tool almost.
Right. I think he manipulates Autotune the way he wants it to be manipulated. You know what I mean? Even when I'm changing the Autotune's attack speed, you know what I mean? Retune speed. It's not the same. Like, sometimes it'll be better, worse, but it's not the same. And with Melodyne, you're changing the way that he's using retune speed changes kind of the feel of the song. And it might sound right, but it's not cool.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point because, like, he's kind of creating the melody right when he's creating the performance. Yeah. A lot of times in pop, people might be singing a songwriter's performance. Yeah. So they might have not created that melody. So really, they're just trying to replicate an existing performance with, you know, their take on it. So accessing the quote unquote original correct melody and helping them get closer to what the songwriter was intending does make more sense in that scenario. And that's why Melodyne, even though it's not a real-time tool, can be helpful to chase that kind of performance as opposed to a live one.
Well, like, I think the main thing here is that, like, it's a very different headspace approach, right? Like, with Autotune, it's a tool to help construct performance. And, like, it's creating a vibe for someone. It's helping them write a song. And with Melodyne, you're going and superseding someone's ability to create a certain moment and computer aiding them in picking up the difference of where they're at least for what I'm doing. Like, I'm using Melodyne in ways that I'm maybe not even making someone perfectly in tune, but I'm making the performance augment the song as best as it can, which is completely different in Mission.
I also use Melodyne in another way, like you mentioned, doing something that was never intended, like creating fake harmonies and like counterpoint melodies. Sometimes that can be good with alternate takes. It's like, oh man, they really should have sang a third or a fifth or something like that. And if you have alternate takes, you can just pitch it up a third and kind of tuck it in as a harmony performance. And that's like using it more of a creative kind of like vocal production tool. But again, all these are different, trying to do the same thing, which is really just help whatever performance is there be the best version of that performance.
And I think kind of in rap, because I do the same thing, but I do it with Autotune or a Harmony Engine or something like that. Because in my world, kind of sounding wrong and synthetic is cooler, you know? And I could make the harmony and I could make it sound like a completely different take, but also making it sound like a robotic mistake makes it a little bit more interesting, especially in the context of what's usually like surrounding that vocal in the song. Usually, like, because it's so much synthetic production and drum samples that have been mixed and mixed and mixed, the synthetic vocal kind of sounds better.
Well, that's a great point. Is, I guess, now that we're talking about all these different platforms, Autotune, Melodyne, whatever, and what you want to do with them, just the straight up sonics of each one of them. Mm-hmm. Now, they all have like a different sound. Like you said, some of them sound a little more robotic, some of them sound a little bit more natural. But what do you like when you're choosing for your sound, Jason? What is it that like you're going for 90% of the time? I mean, I know it's probably song dependent.
I think it's also intention dependent, right? Like, a lot of times with the guys I'm working with, I'm trying to preserve the performance and like best understand that artist's intention with what they're doing and fill in any gaps that they can't provide in real time in the moment. And even within that, like, there's certain things that Autotune is just better at. Like if someone hits a note and they kind of drift a little sharp, sometimes Autotune in that exact instance is better than Melodyne. It's
so like drift
stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Autotune to me handles that way better. And whereas like maybe you just didn't quite get to the note, or like you're kind of floating around a bunch of different pitch centers. And so like, you're, 10 cents sharp over here, but you're like 20 cents flat on this one. And it's not the most enduring way of doing it. Melodyne's great for that, where you can just have like this big global tune and how tight that needs to be.
Sure.
So I kind of use each for a different reason. I sonically a lot of times end up preferring how Melodyne sounds, but it's still got a pretty specific sound. It has that kind of breathy, weird kind of thing.
I will say this. I don't really love the way Melodyne sounds. It sounds like a synth and a vocal to me.
Do you feel it loses high end? Because I feel when you lose a little bit of your high end in Melodyne, where I don't get that in Autotune. It's kind of the opposite. You almost get like a upper mid exaggeration that's kind of nice and pleasant for energy.
I feel like Melodyne makes it 100% makes it like softer. I think would be the like
sure. Losing high end, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's what I feel about it. You lose just a teeny bit.
And Autotune definitely has that kind of, I would say, like grating feel, but it's definitely not like in a negative way. It kind of just feels. I think that it's part of the reason people like Autotune so much is because it gives it this energetic feel. You know what I mean?
Right.
Either by adding notes in between, or by just adding those sonic elements to the vocal.
Yeah, who was the mix guy like a couple of years ago that was kind of always using it as like a matter of course, not so much for like tuning or performance reasons, but literally just the sonics. I think it may have been Puig that would just use it on like a vocal to say like, oh yeah, I needed it to feel like Autotune.
This actually brings up a good point about like, you're saying a while ago that was a thing. I think Autotune sounds very different in that color per version.
Yeah.
And for people that have been working for a while, they know that like, oh man, 4, the mid range was like really pronounced. That was like the OG T-Pain era of like when you hit it really hard, you got that like 3K bump, but that was like excitement and that was cool. And then I think over time they kind of like mellowed out the algorithm, but people are like, yo, that old algorithm was really kind of dope. Can we come back to that? What's up, Antares?
I mean, that's why Autotune Pro is fucking incredible.
Nice.
The classic mode, which is just the algorithm for 5. I actually approached them before that came out. I was like, can we make Autotune 5 again? Just call it classic, whatever, call it. And they're like, yeah, we're already doing that. You're late. Nice. You're way late. I was like, oh, cool. I guess I'm an idiot. Whatever.
As a quick aside on this, does it annoy the shit out of you guys that plugin manufacturers version things in a way that's not backwards compatible? So I mean that like, if you open up Autotune 4 today, it's never gonna fucking come up. What's up with that?
Oh, that kills me. I mean, I love Antares for their product. And like you said, we've talked about how useful and creative Autotune is as a tool, but man, they are killing me not having backwards compatible versions. I literally have 2 old computers that only exist to pull up old versions of Autotune so I can look at the settings and either Audio Suite commit it or like recreate it with one of the new algorithms because it just can't pull up. Now I get that there's new features from one to the other, but man, you should be able to pull up key and retune speed at a dead minimum across all versions.
So one thing for all recording engineers out there, if you want to save your mix engineer some time, screenshot your Autotune settings. And label each picture.
Right there. That's like the best thing I've ever heard.
And include them in the session. I just got a session with that in it, and it saved me so much time because I also have my old computer just for Autotune 5. And that computer takes so long to load up a session. It's a laptop from 2010. It's terrible.
Pro tip, what I did with my old computer for that one is I removed every plugin. So like literally it's no plugins on that rig other than the old Autotune. So like nothing shows up and it loads pretty quick except the Autotune. And that's exactly what I do is I just screenshot it real quick and then recreate it. Or if they're butthurt about the sound, you know, I just commit it or whatever. But you're right. That's just shout out to whoever tracked that and did that screenshot for you. What a pro move.
Yeah.
So, okay, here's a follow-up question on that then. Is anyone using any of the timing functions of Autotune?
I personally never have because like I like the timing stuff in Melodyne more, or we could talk about some other programs like, you know, Vocalign and Revoice. You know, I think those have some better time correction stuff going on.
What the fuck is Revoice? What's this shit?
Well, you know, like I'm actually just checking out Revoice right now, so I'm certainly not a pro on it like I am with some of the other things I've spent more time with. I'm not a pro on anything. Who am I bullshitting? But Revoice basically is kind of like their best of because it's creating all the Vocalign time correction based stuff and those algorithms, which sound good, but there's more detail to be had, like Vocalign Pro that you can do like a little bit more subtle nuance. And then Revoice also adds a pitch element. So it's basically like Melodyne plus Vocalign together. It's a lot. There's a lot of things going on with that. And it's obviously not a real-time process. You have to like render the audio, but it does sound good for stacks and backgrounds. And like if you're like, oh, I wish these were tighter and more in tune, you can do it in like an all-in-one platform as opposed to being like, I'll Vocalign for the tightness and then I'll move it to Melodyne for the pitch. So they're trying to basically get you with an all-in-one. And the algorithm sounds quite good, but.
So with Revoice, what you're saying is that it matches the pitch relatively to the lead vocals pitch.
That's right. So you can basically pick like your leader of the pack and be like, now I want the other ones to do this.
Okay.
Which there's been ways to do that in Melodyne too through like, in the Melodyne Studio application, you can see the layers. And if you spend the time to tune the first one as your guide pitch, you can kind of see the layers underneath and almost visually just move them into place, which is nice. But Revoice is taking it a step further and doing that through its kind of automated process.
That's insane that is now where we're at. I mean, are you doing much Vocalign stuff in what you're doing, Alex?
Well, I've been doing a lot of R&B and lately, and honestly, no. And
good for you. I mean, it's nice when you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's really great.
But also, like, I don't know, it's just me, but I think that because the closer we get to perfection, the cooler imperfection is.
Sure.
To me. So like, that's why I like the way Autotune sounds, how it sounds a little wrong. That's why I like mistakes. I leave a lot of weird stuff in because it's interesting now. If it's just like, if you could paint a perfect picture, a perfect recreation of a picture every time you painted, then surrealism becomes better. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really need that anymore.
No, I agree. One of my beefs with Vocalign was that the default algorithm, if you're working on like a 4-stack together, I thought it is way too tight, like way too tight. 4 vocals sound like 1.5 all of a sudden. Yeah. Why would you want that if they bothered to perform it 4 times? So it's nice that there's some looser functions. You know, I even used to do it by hand, like kind of just chopping the parts that were really off and nudging them around.
That's what I do more than anything.
Sure.
I mean, it's funny you say that because that has become basically my favorite way of getting the Vocalign functionality. It's like, to me, like, I agree with you, Alex. Vocalign gets way too tight and it's like kind of abnormal. And there is some perks from a production standpoint from Vocalign. Like sometimes if I just sum total when I'm producing don't like the way someone's saying it, I might go shittily, terribly sing a version of it with my timing and then Vocalign my timing onto their pitching and performance.
I had a question for you, Jason, and you probably would get this more than anybody else, but like I've heard people use Vocalign for guitar performances as well too, for like a double. Have you ever tried that out, or is it pretty much strictly been vocals for you?
You know, I'm a real piece of shit and don't do that.
No. I mean, like, I don't even know if it sounds good. I was really just more curious if it's like, oh yeah, that's a good trick. It works for like acoustic, putting the transients together, or you're like, no, the algorithm is too crazy. I was just curious.
I've tried it once or twice, and my thought was that like it works as advertised, but it's also makes stuff a little phasey.
Yeah,
but
sure.
To me, in a lot of ways today, like the hit version of like the modern Vocalign for vocal production is like, you know, if you need to nudge something around, like either do it by hand or take, you know, like crazy space. I'll take pitch and time and use the trim tool and Pro Tools and just hand trim something to like time stretch it to fairly match up if you have like a really long note at the end of the phrase.
And in regards to, you know, aligning vocals and everything, I think when it comes to hand tuning and hand aligning everything, I think comping becomes a part of the conversation as well. You know?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think at least in rap, it's live comping. You have a track that you're recording on, and then you have a bunch of tracks underneath, and when you want to keep one, you start organizing it below that track. So you're dragging and dropping vocal takes, and you might have like the first two be the leads, so you can drag one, then drag the other to the other one, and back and forth and back and forth. Then when you're getting ad-libs and backgrounds, you're going down to the tracks below, and you start labeling them. And at least when I did some R&B and pop recording, I still live comped, which a lot of people don't do. But I just had more tracks, and I would just move the record track down as we moved down so that I can keep an eye on everything. But I was recording, so say we had our lead and then 6 stacks underneath. You know, you have the bottom 6 stacks, you have the first 3 pan left and the next 3 panned hard right. And as you went down, you would, you know, pan them more in, pan them more out, and kind of get like an actual vibe going. But to record live and comp live, it was always just hard left, and then the new take would be right, and then as you went down, you'd start to like hard pan each way.
Whenever you're working with a vocalist, do you ever ask them too how they like to hear their stacks as they're recording them? I know sometimes while people are creating stacks, they have like very specific things they like to hear. I had one artist one time, this was really weird, but it created for very tight vocal performance, so it just worked for her. She wanted all of her stacks, no matter how many they were, panned right, and the vocal that she was currently singing panned left. And like when she heard it get dialed in, she knew it was a good take, and if it was a kind of a weak stack, she'd be like, no, that wasn't tight. And basically that created not having to do Vocalign after it. So that was like a real interesting thing.
In pop and in like anytime that someone's singing a lot of stacks, I think that is the trick.
Yeah, sure.
The new vocal should always be panned hard away from all of the old vocals.
Right,
and
right.
I mean, a lot of people don't like that and it throws them off, but it gets the 100% best performance, because if you're off even a little bit, it messes with you hard.
Right.
And like, usually in those situations, I'm recording with headphones on myself, because if they're going to do it, I need to be there in the same headspace that they are. And man, if somebody messes up, it's really obvious.
To me, you said something a second ago that like, I know what you're talking about, but can you clarify it for anyone who doesn't when you were talking about using the record track?
Okay. You have all of your audio tracks set up in Pro Tools, right? So you have your main audio track on top, which is what the track that you're recording to. And then below it, you have, 6 to 8 audio tracks below it that are just set up for you to drag and drop audio down to. And so you have your like main armed track on the top, and you're constantly recording to that. And then I'm also playlisting as I go, so I never lose anything.
Oh, so you're a playlist guy.
Yeah.
I have strong feelings about that too. Do you use playlists, Jason?
I do use playlists, but I actually, Alex and I do it almost identically because I playlist everything, but I'm also building the comp off of a record track as I'm going.
Now, I comp as I go too, which sounds like what you're doing. But the one thing I don't like is playlist, only because visually it becomes harder to see them. I know you can have in Pro Tools, you can have the fold down view so you can see all of them. So basically what I do is I just create, like Alex said, a whole bunch of blank tracks, but I have them muted. And what I'll do is if we do multiple takes of the same phrase over and over, like if a singer really wants to try it a few different ways, I'll kind of like mark them as I go with the color region. Right. And if I think they did a good one, I'll just kind of like color that one yellow. And then after they've done 6 takes, they're like, oh, let's listen to one. I'll just go right back to the yellow takes and maybe like piece that together. And they might hear a comp of 3 different takes all on the first playback. And they're like, oh, I killed that one. And I'm like, well, that was the best of the best, but still.
Do you color code all of your vocals yellow out of curiosity?
Oh, the ones that are good, yes, coincidentally. Like, I do actually color code them yellow if it's like a good keeper take. That's just coincidentally the color that I always go for.
That's 100% what I do. That's really
gnarly,
funny.
Man.
Yeah.
It pops out the most. Gnarly.
One thing, the difference between when I use playlists and when I do what Miles does, because I also do what Miles does in certain situations, is how confident the performer is in what they're doing.
Oh, okay.
Because if we're 99.9% of the time keeping what I comp originally, then I'll playlist.
Oh, that makes sense.
But if we're going back and forth and like going around, then playlisting is not the best option because you want to be able to click all the options as fast as possible and them all.
That's exactly
and them
why
all
I do
to
it that
be
way.
in front of you. Whereas when I'm playlisting, I'm only playlisting so that when there's something wrong on one of the takes throughout the whole song, I can just open it and it's all chronologically recorded. So each take, it kind of like cascades down. And all I have to do is scroll down to that take, pick any of the takes, and then just start auditioning each take for just maybe that one word. Or like you were saying before, like there's an extra take and I want to pitch it up and make it a harmony. That's what I'll use that for.
So I actually have a philosophical question about comping. So I've got really strong feelings on it. And there's a lot of time in my life that I've spent comping vocals. And I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking about the single most important thing in the song. And you're also having to be the person that is helping decide, helping make the mechanics of, keep track of all of the takes and the emotion that's happening within that vocal. So to me, there's kind of 2 different headspaces I've seen with comping is, are you trying to realize the artist's intention or are you trying to realize a different intention, like one that's by the song, or maybe you're going for a specific thing or something that's not always what they're looking for to show them a different version of it?
Well, I think there's 2, you can do a couple different ways, but it's kind of like 2 general schools of thought. One, we're getting as much as we can in this moment, in this vibe. We'll figure out the comp later. 2, let's build it as we go. And if they gain confidence in the comp, maybe that will affect them better to create and try different things further on as they listen. And that's usually like session dependent. If an artist comes in and is like, yo, I got an hour. I'm like, great. We're singing everything. Just sing it down as many times as you can. I'll sort the comp and then we'll listen back. And if we missed a piece or we don't have a take, we're confident in one line of the verse, we got to schedule another recording. But if we're building it as we go and we have the time to do it, they might listen back and be like, ooh, I killed that first verse. Let me try the second verse again.
And this is still comping as you go, right?
Correct. Absolutely. Like 9 times out of 10, it's how much time we're putting in building a quick comp so that they're confident, or it's just like, let's get all these takes and we can do a deep dive. We can also maybe tune, going back to what we did earlier, some of the stuff later and, get it then.
Speaking of that, when you guys are recording, are you using Autotune Live or are you putting it in post?
For me, post. I'm almost always post every time.
For me, that is entirely up to what makes the singer comfortable. I would prefer it in post 100% of the time. But if the singer wants to hear it with tune based on their performance, which obviously, like if you get an artist like that, that makes a lot of sense that you would want to do whatever they feel best with.
You know what? I actually just lied with what I was saying. And I'm now that I'm kind of thinking about it, because I'm a
dirty liar.
Fucking moron over here. If I've got a singer who's struggling with pitch, I'll cut some tracks until I get one that's as good as possible and then drag it to a separate track and put auto-tune on it. And it's like, hey man, like you should really try to like double the vocal you did because it was great. Because now that it's tuned, it gives them a really good pitch reference for where they're at. And if they double that, now I've got a better lead that isn't going to need the same amount of tuning to get it there.
And I think that's interesting because for me, I use autotune stylistically, right? Most of the time it's a style. So it has to be on the vocal while you're recording because if the person's not singing into it, the style is not there. It's just a good vocal at that point, which is cool. But in my situation, it's not. And then what Jason was just talking about is specifically just to get the best performance possible on a new lead. And I think it's really interesting, at least from like a musical standpoint, how different those two approaches are and how they get completely different results, but exactly what you want for the situation.
Well, and I think this gets back to the initial question, which is like, what's the intention of the artist and how much are you looking to gratify what their intention is, you know? And to me, that is almost always the ultimate crux of what you're trying to get out of a vocal, which is like, am I making something that's believable? Does it sound credible? Am I respecting what they're going after? Do I agree with what they're going after? And for me, almost always I am, or I'm helping them craft that if I'm in a producing position. But how much am I trying to find the intention of the track and move that forward?
That's a really great point because you just mentioned what you are functionally doing is being a producer or a vocal producer, and you're aiding in the performance from a creative standpoint. Even though it might be the artist's vision, you're helping move that along. And a lot of times nowadays, engineers might be the only person making this decision. Yep. So you're kind of taking on a little bit more than the mic chain is good. I'm not clipping in Pro Tools. I'm also helping the creativity. And I think that's something that's going to be important, especially if you work on vocal-based music, to have that chop and have that understanding of, I'm going to have to do more than just make sure the mic isn't overloading. I got to really help this performance move along to be the best version it can be.
I think that, in regards to that, one thing that I noticed specifically with autotune recordings is that there are people that just slap on autotune, put it in the right key, and that's it. And then I also am getting questions all the time about what settings should I be using? Like what retune speed, what humanize, vibrato, all that. But the answer to that is always what sounds best? Like literally what sounds best? Like I get zero retune speed on zero humanize more than I get anything else, or I get 20 retune speed, which means that you just didn't touch it, you know?
Right.
And I've used zero retune speed in moments before, but to me, it never sounds best. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
even 1 to 6 sound better to me than 0, and they basically are the same effect. And up to 8, I would say, are almost identical to like full retune speed but it's a little bit more human. You know what I mean? And I would say somewhere between 17 and 30 is where it still sounds like autotune and like cool, but it's not like you're a fucking robot.
Another pro tip with settings when it comes to that, and this seems real obvious, but it's worth pointing out, is like chromatic at 17 to 30 is not really going to help if you haven't set a key. Yeah. Not in the same way that you might be pulling for. So, you know, spend the time to make sure you know the performance and the tune is in the key. And if the artist is trying to do something like that is a chromatic run, you might set it up for just that section,
Definitely.
but otherwise stay in the key of the song.
Are you guys ever doing the MIDI triggering thing with autotune?
Ooh, I've done that occasionally for like effect.
Yeah.
You know, like if you want to pull a melody like kind of in a different way than it was performed, and that actually can be really great sometimes.
I've done that for Harmony Engine.
Oh, cool.
Which Francis and the Lights kind of made. They call it the Prismizer, is I think they call it, like which is that Bon Iver effect.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a great one.
And like, so I've done that on a lot of Thug tracks, but I almost, instead of, you know, MIDI doing it every time, sometimes I'll just make like 40 of them and just like drag and drop into different notes. You know what I mean?
See which one sounds
and
good.
And that way I can have the options in front of me and just kind of mute as I go. And so I'll have like 8 of them and just kind of muting and committing as I go, which is the same effect, but it's a little bit, more ham-fisted.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like in a way, it actually saves time.
Yeah.
Because you might have not really known exactly where you wanted it to go, but you wanted it to go somewhere. So just the drag and drop and auditioning might save more time than thinking it has to be a 5th and it has to be this level of thing where you're like, oh, that one sounds good. Let's go with that.
So quick other question for you guys. Does anyone ever comp together a vocal after the fact? Like, 2 days go by, you've recorded all the vocals, and now you're going to sit down and pick out all the performances. You guys ever doing that?
All the time. Sometimes vocals get sent to me recorded that way, and they're like, you do the comp. You know what I mean? So that definitely, it can all depend on like how people want to do the songwriting, but that definitely happens to me a lot.
Which do you prefer?
Oh, if I can help it, I'd like to be there, because if you're cutting the vocal, you have an opportunity to be like, none of this is landing. Let's try something else. Whereas like if people send me that, for the most part, they're like, that's what we got. Make it work. And you're much more limited.
But as far as like the comping goes, like the actual, like I'm going to pick, this verse or this line from this verse. Would you rather do that while you're recording or a day after the fact?
I see benefits to both. I see some, like, there's a nicety to like letting it sit, not getting caught up in the moment and being like, ooh, I'm more objective. This really is the best take, versus like they did a little dance or something at the end of the performance and you were like, ooh, that's hot. But it actually wasn't that hot. You were just kind of like caught up in it. So I see strengths on both options. Whereas like if you catch it in the moment, that's kind of special. But if you're really objective, that can be good too.
I think the point on objectivity is important to touch on too, is sometimes during that session, your ears aren't hearing right anymore. You know what I mean?
Very true.
Because your relative pitch changes based on the singer. So maybe like taking a day off and coming back to it with fresh ears, you're like, oh, this person was fucking up so much that I thought that this was good. You know what I mean? And then you got to go back to another take and be like, oh, okay, so this take was actually better and actually more usable than the rest of it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Kind of you get the best of both worlds, whereas like you make sure it's all getting put down really well while you're there, but you really sort through it later to like with the fine tooth comb.
My gut is this. I always want to comp it live as much as possible. And nice. I'm never going to remember how I feel about this vocal in this moment while I'm recording it ever again. If I totally swing a fucking miss on it, I'd rather know what I was thinking while I was there with the artist and, oh my God, like I love this vocal so fucking much. And maybe I'm completely wrong and that's fine. But 9 times out of 10, I'm at least 85% right.
I think that's actually a good way to tie everything in together, is in the moment, you want to get the best performance. If you're not getting the best performance, you want to have the best settings so you can capture the best, audio and the best feeling from the whole thing. You want to Vocalign in the moment so that everything feels right. So the next day you come back and everything sounds better to you. And then you want to comp and you want to get everything at least as close to finished in the moment as you can. And I think that's super important when you're doing vocals, is because you're going to come back the next day. And if it doesn't sound finished and it doesn't sound right, your next day's starting point is now much, much lower in.
Totally.
And I think that when you're doing vocals and when you're recording in general, people kind of think, let's finish that later. And I think that the general point here is that you should finish it that day.
Yep. Yeah, or at least get as many options as possible so that when you come back to it, you're not stuck with just the one option. And like, that's going to be the take.
So I think actually that's a good place to wrap it up here, is do the best you can that day. Get the best settings, make sure you have everything in key, make sure you're getting all the right takes, make sure you're capturing the best performance, and make sure it all sounds better. For the This Sounds Better podcast, this has been Jason Kingsland, Miles Walker, and Alex Tumay.